is an accomplished corporate executive and public servant who, until 2 weeks ago, as you may have heard in the news, served as the Senior Vice President of the Susan G. Komen for the Cure Foundation, a breast cancer charity where she was responsible for leading Komen's federal and state advocacy efforts. Karen resigned that post on February 7th over a funding dispute with Planned Parenthood, stepping down after the abortion giant unleashed a media blitz against Komen's decision in December to discontinue its funding. Mrs. Handel called it a premeditated shakedown to coerce a private entity to give them grants. Karen Handel grew up in the Washington, D.C. area, started out her business career working for Hallmark Cards, and later transitioned into the political arena, serving as Deputy Chief of Staff to Vice President Dan Quayle's wife, Marilyn, where she worked to promote breast cancer research and awareness. Having relocated to Georgia, by 2002, she was named Deputy Chief of Staff by Georgia Governor Sonny Perdue and was in 2003 elected Chairman of Georgia's Fulton County Board of Commissioners. By 2006, she was serving as Georgia's Secretary of State, resigning in 2010 to run for the Republican nomination for governor of Georgia. While she lost that bid in a close primary runoff, she was soon after, in 2011, appointed Senior Vice President of Public Policy at Susan G. Komen for the Cure, a leading charity in the cause of fighting breast cancer. There's much more to the story, of course, but we'll all the more interested in hearing from Karen herself regarding the true story behind the headlines of the past 2 weeks. So won't you please give Karen Handel a warm welcome to Patrick Henry College.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
So this really is a newsmaker interview because you've made a lot of news over the past several weeks.
Apparently.
Has it been fun?
I'm not sure I would describe it as fun, Marvin. Let's say I've had a number of worst, best events in my life, and this might be one of them.
Okay. We'll come back to that in a moment, but let me go into a little bit of the background.
Sure.
Starting when you're Secretary of State. So this was your first try at statewide office, and you were successful in doing that. What was the key issue you faced there?
In Secretary of State's race? Really, it was more about voter fraud. Some of the conservative issues did come up because obviously for being a Republican, we want to have conservative candidates. So that's always one of the underlying issues in any race. But most generally, it was about voter fraud. Were we going to move forward with voter ID in Georgia? Because remember, in Georgia, we had not had an elected Republican Secretary of State ever. So I was the first elected Republican in the state of Georgia. So it was very much focused on those elections issues.
And let me ask about that issue then, photo ID, because that's going to be a big issue in lots of states right now. What was your experience with it?
You know, Georgia had passed the photo ID law a few years before I was elected Secretary of State, and it was languishing, not being implemented, frankly, because the then Democratic Secretary of State would not put together a viable implementation plan, if you will. And clearly, from where I sat and what I believe, and I think we would all agree, that if you're going to change the rules around voting, any of the requirements, doesn't that also come with a very high responsibility to educate voters about what's going to be required of them? And photo ID was most certainly a common sense procedure to put in place to make sure that we had the highest level of integrity in our elections possible. And so, I mean, simply with our team, we put together a really strong implementation plan. And once we did that, we were able to get out of the injunction before the courts, and off we went.
How do you work that when there's so much absentee balloting?
Well, we then moved to in-person early voting.
Okay.
And we also made sure that for by-mail absentee voting, that we went in and did a comprehensive review of how that was being conducted and made sure that we were doing multiple signature checks. Okay. It's a little bit in the weeds, but if you care about this, I'll go into it. Yeah. When you register to vote, you sign in. When you apply for an absentee ballot by mail, you sign that. And what we wanted to make sure, and then at the end, when you turn in your voted ballot, you sign that as well, right? So you sign 3 times. So we wanted to make sure that all elections officials in Georgia were laying those signatures out straight across and making sure that they lined up, so that we at least had that check. And that was why we wanted to have as much in-person voting as possible, because if you vote in person, you're showing your photo ID, and that is the most secure way to vote.
Okay. moving then to the gubernatorial contest. You're running for governor. A lot of candidates. You win the first round. You're ahead in the first round, but not with a majority, and so you go to a runoff, and you lose the runoff to the fellow who does become governor, Nathan Deal, by a couple thousand votes. It was very close. What happened between the first round and then the runoff so that your lead evaporated and he was able to come and just edge you out?
Well, I think it was a couple of things. I lost that race by right around 2,500 votes. It's kind of etched in my memory. Actually, and a point around how every vote really does count, that equaled 1 vote per precinct in the state of Georgia. So every vote really, really does count. I think, what happened, and I try not to dwell too much on what didn't work, because sometimes things just happen for a reason and you lose, and that's not because anybody did anything bad. Just sometimes you don't always win, and I think that this was one of those cases. What did become an issue in the runoff was whether or not I was truly pro-life, and there was a great deal of attention around that. Because, candidly, I did not get the endorsement of Georgia Right to Life. Out of a field of 7 candidates, 7 or 8, 7 I guess, I was the only individual who did not receive Georgia Right to Life's endorsement. And not only did they not endorse me, they chose the endorsement time to actually go on the attack about who I was and what I believed in. And I think in the end that had a really significant impact. And then it got quite personal, and really, I think some real lines were crossed. I don't think that anybody would say that going on television and saying that a woman who can't have children is a desperate, barren individual. And that's the tenor of what happened. And so the irony now of not being pro-life enough in the governor's race to now fast forward to where I am today of being arguably too pro-life, there's a lot of irony there, so we'll leave that at that.
And Georgia Right to Life said you weren't sufficiently pro-life because you allowed for a rape and incest exception?
I do think that there should be an exception for rape and incest. Not that I think that killing a baby for any purpose is right, just, or moral. More that if we're going to be in a place of trying to legislate, it's a really tough one to legislate to a mom and a dad of a 13-year-old. And, I think a better route to go is through parental notification and using the requirement to have the sonogram so that everyone can know, and that individual with their family really needs to have very close counseling with their pastor, and we would all, or whomever is their faith counselor, would like to say that everyone would choose life 100%. I will tell you that were I governor or in elected office, I would be hard-pressed to look a mom and a dad in the face and tell them what was going to happen with their 12, 13, 14-year-old. The other issue that was contentious was around fertility treatments. Again, I think that we do need to have some better checks and balances around fertility clinics and what happens there, because what was her name, the Octomom lady in California, was an absolute travesty. Yet, I simply am not prepared to look a parent in the face who has a family thanks to fertility. And I'm an individual of very strong faith. And so if we believe that all things come from God, would we not then think that perhaps the science behind fertility treatments also had some sort of divineness to them? And I just was not prepared to tell those families that they were immoral and that their children were immoral. And that, in the end, was why I didn't get the endorsement.
So, we could have a lot of discussion of those issues, but it certainly seems unfair to me to say, for an organization to say that you are not pro-life, because you allow those exceptions. Again, I'm not necessarily agreeing with you, but it seems to be very unfair treatment.
Well, it may be, and it may not be. Again, I try not to dwell on it, because in the end, Georgia Right to Life, an election, other people, by virtue of what they say, they don't get to define me. I mean, in the end, I define myself through my words and my deeds. And ultimately, the opinions that I care the most about are that of God and my husband. I don't really like to disappoint that man because he is really incredibly wonderful. And so
you've been married for 20 years now?
It'll be 20 years in November. So I try not to think about that and about whether it was fair or whatever, because again, as I said, sometimes you lose and sometimes things aren't fair. What I will say that for all of us who care about, moving society to a more, a stronger culture of life, sometimes you have to invoke the Margaret Thatcher approach to things, and she had this great approach that it was relentless incrementalism. Because sometimes you can't just get everything in one fell swoop. And when Roe versus Wade was first acted on, we didn't have the science that we have today. I mean, we didn't know about fetal pain, right? And so there are some really common sense things that the overwhelming majority of people in this country can get their heads around and be supportive of. And, there are any number of pieces of legislation now around fetal pain, and I would hope that those will move forward, and certainly would like to be able to be helpful in pushing those forward.
Okay. So after this very contentious gubernatorial campaign, you then move several months later to a very calm position on something that everyone can support, namely the battle against breast cancer, and it looked to be a nice place to be for a while.
Exactly. Calm and not too much controversy.
Right.
Just do my job, keep my head down, stay out of the press.
And okay, so you get there and you start examining basically the portfolio. And for folks who don't know, maybe you could explain just a little bit about the Komen Foundation, how large it is, how many grants it gives out, and what percentage of the total giving was to Planned Parenthood.
Sure.
And why there was money going to Planned Parenthood.
Okay. Komen is what's called an affiliated organization. So there are 120 independent affiliates around the country. And are you familiar with the Races for the Cure? So a great deal of funding is raised through Races for the Cure. And with those dollars, 75% stay in the local community, 25% go to Komen National. The community grants are all determined at the affiliate level. And it's there that the Planned Parenthood grants were given based on community assessments. National did not give dollars to Planned Parenthood. And with that said, obviously Komen is Komen. Nobody cares if we're an affiliate or whatever. You just see the name Komen. There were 19 Planned Parenthood grants totaling $680,000. The majority of them were for education programs. A few were for mammograms, but not for mammographies directly. And that's a really important point that is often missed in this debate. Planned Parenthood does not give mammograms. Does not. They do mammography referrals, which is an entirely different thing. The $680,000 is less than 1% of Komen's $93 million community granting portfolio, less than 1%. For Planned Parenthood, that $680,000 is even less a percentage of their $1 billion in revenue. And so this great outcry that somehow women were going to be left in the lurch was nothing more than a PR spin on the part of Planned Parenthood, because clearly for Komen, with a $93 million granting portfolio, we not only had the capacity to ensure that there were no gaps, there were going to be no gaps because the organization was already at work with those affiliates to make sure that that didn't occur.
Now, pro-life groups were saying that it was $680,000 for breast cancer referrals, but that's fungible money. It was helping Planned Parenthood generally, and thus you were receiving pressure from pro-life groups to stop doing that. And what I gather is that at a certain point, you and others were saying, essentially, who needs the aggravation for this very small part of what we're doing and really tangential to our main goal? Why are we doing this?
Yep, that's right. And it was even a little more than that. You know, Komen, long before I got to the organization was already looking at their grants in great detail, analyzing impact. You know, were the grants having the kinds of outcomes that an organization like Komen, as well respected as Komen, was going to expect, and frankly, that donors would expect from their hard-earned dollars. And so the organization was already transitioning its granting strategy into a totally different direction and would have very much affected those Planned Parenthood grants. At the same time, there was the growing controversy and the increasing amount of time that Komen staff, both at the national level and in our communities, were having to spend managing issues that had nothing whatsoever to do with Komen or the fight against breast cancer. And so all of those things together really brought us to the place where, you know, we really should look at how can we transition out for, number one, the best interest of the mission of the fight against breast cancer, and equally as important, making sure that we did everything to ensure that the women that Komen serves were not going to be negatively impacted.
And you did not blindside Planned Parenthood with that decision. You gave them plenty of advance time. When did you tell Planned Parenthood that you were not going to welcome other grant requests from them?
The Komen president had a conversation with the Planned Parenthood president sometime around the middle of December, and really explained all of this, the change in granting strategy, that, you know, we weren't making a judgment on whether or not the issues were real or perceived. We just knew that they didn't have anything to do with breast cancer. And really, for lack of a better phrase, we were looking to have a magnanimous breakup, if you will. And, you know, reassured Planned Parenthood, there was much made that we were pulling the grants. Not so. The existing grants, Komen committed to funding those all the way through the end of them. And in fact, several were going to continue for another year, because in at least one community, there were 2 grants that it was determined by our community health department that there needed to be a 1-year transition to ensure that there was no gap. So Komen made every effort to make this a smooth transition, and you know, clearly, very much all of us underestimated the visceral response, the very political response that Planned Parenthood was going to take. Because if you think about $680,000 against a $1 billion budget for the organization, this was about something other than this small, minuscule amount of grants in their world. It was about the politics, and it was about their pro-abortion agenda, and that's a fact.
And just before we go to that, let me just ask one question about the response of the pro-life groups when they learned that Komen was not going to be welcoming more grant requests from Planned Parenthood. Did they shoot off fireworks and send out releases and say, victory is ours? No. And, you know, as we worked through this issue, one of the things that we wanted to be very mindful of is that we knew that there were going to be folks who looked at this through a political prism. And we worked hard to make this not be viewed in that way. And candidly, those of us in the organization who did have relationships with conservatives in the pro-life community, we specifically said, let's not make this a celebration. We want to be able to just move forward. And I will tell you, I think that was probably a mistake in our desire to not give a scalp, if you will, to either side, although arguably it was my scalp that was given. But I think maybe that was an error, that maybe we should have just let both sides have the debate. But I guess you went forward on the assumption that you made the decision in mid-December, and going forward that neither side was going to be shouting about it. That's right. And then Planned Parenthood started shouting. Why? When did that first occur, and why do you think it happened then? Well, it would have been that Monday before the first Associated Press story. Okay. You know, I don't know. I mean, I think a question should be asked around the timing. Was it pure coincidence that the attack against Komen around abortion rights occurred in the same week
that everything escalated to fever pitch around contraception and the White House and the Catholic Church.
So move the spotlight, basically, in a sense. Okay, so what happens first? Take us through those several days of infamy.
Yeah, it was very obviously stressful. Everyone was, doing their level best to manage the issue. But I think for those of you who watched the news coverage, I mean, it was quite literally just a vicious, full-on assault on Komen across multiple channels. So it wasn't just in the press. It was against Komen's donors. I mean, imagine people who were corporate contributors to Komen were seeing their Facebooks just being completely raided. They were being picketed. CEOs were getting phone calls and emails. Twitter, I mean, just exploded with some of the most vile and vicious things that you can possibly imagine. And so for the outside companies who were supporters of Komen, again, most of these companies aren't interested in being in the middle of the debate either. So they're thinking, whoa. And it was really quite, I will say, I have to say, impressive what Planned Parenthood, in collaboration with MoveOn.org, Change.org, I mean, they had petitions teed up and ready to go within, hours of the AP story hitting out on the wires. So clearly it was premeditated. And Komen just simply, Komen's a breast cancer organization. I mean, this was mafia-style shakedown tactics by Planned Parenthood, holding Komen hostage for $680,000. That's what this was. And Komen did not have the bandwidth to fight that. And, for as much as I disagree with and think it was a mistake to capitulate, I'm not going to pass judgment on, for Ambassador Brinker, who founded the organization, for her, desire to do what she thought was best in the board, their desire to do what was best for the survival of the organization.
So all through January, you and other folks at Komen think there's peace.
Yes.
But there is no peace. Meanwhile, Planned Parenthood is assembling its armies,
yes,
its journalistic corps, its bloggers, ready to go whenever they signal this is the right time to go.
That's right. So,
what's your thinking about? Again, we don't like to think in terms of conspiracies or anything like that, but there seems to have been, you're saying, an organized movement here behind the scenes with lots of people in the press collaborating to give the Planned Parenthood message and not give you a fair shake.
I mean, I think the truly liberal bias within the press, and even I'll go so far as to say the pro-abortion bias within the press, that somehow, in order to be supportive of women's rights, that equals abortion rights. That was the mentality that kind of we came up against. And for me as a woman, I reject that notion. I reject that. One has nothing to do with the other. And I think that for the pro-life movement, all of us who care about the issue, better sit up and take notice of what happened. Because if that organization, if Planned Parenthood can come in and do what it did to an organization like Komen that had, think about it, Komen is considered a pretty strong entity. If they could do that to a Komen, what are they willing to do next?
So other companies or foundations had tried to break free at times.
Mm-hmm.
AT&T, back in the 1990s, had been giving money to Planned Parenthood, stopped doing so, and survived. Right? Walmart was giving money to Planned Parenthood, tried to back off, but then had to give in, right? And Walmart still is giving money to Planned Parenthood.
I think the big difference there is the timing, and that in the early 90s with AT&T, they were faced with full-page ads in the newspaper and billboards, etc. but you didn't have the real-time media that you have today. You didn't have Twitter and Facebook and all of the social media that can just put, you know, enormous pressure in such a short amount of time, intense pressure on an entity. And I think that that was really the big difference. And again, I'll say for Komen, I mean, Komen has one person who does social media, one. I mean, we're not a social media organization, it's a breast cancer organization. And, you know, to have to come up against, to make a decision that had great merit and was logical and was indeed and remains in the best interest of the mission of the organization, to then come up against Planned Parenthood and all of the resources that it marshaled against Komen, it was really unwinnable probably from the beginning.
So in the short run, this seems like a victory for Planned Parenthood, right? In that, number one, Planned Parenthood getting a lot more money out of it. Not only looks like more money from Komen down the road, but Mayor Bloomberg contributing $250,000, this foundation, that foundation, kicking in $100,000 here, $1 million there. Soon it adds up to big money. And so it's a nice thing for Planned Parenthood. Plus, they certainly indicate once you give, you better not back away. So it's a lesson, as you say, a shakedown for everyone. What in the long run do you think will be the result of this?
I think, I hope a couple of things. One, I hope that for the pro-life movement that perhaps this maybe energizes the movement a bit more. Secondly, you know, I don't know if in the long run it will be a positive for Planned Parenthood from a donor standpoint. I think about if you are the head of a corporation or you're the head of the charitable contributions program for a company and you haven't been giving to Planned Parenthood and you watched all this play out, I think it would probably give you pause to even engage in the first place. So while they might be secure in what they have today, potentially it might make it very difficult for Planned Parenthood to grow its base beyond what it has today.
Now, Planned Parenthood is also threatened because a number of states have cut off state funding to Planned Parenthood. Depending on how the election goes in November, it's possible that federal funding of Planned Parenthood could be cut off. So, what do you think is the picture? I mean, from the inside of Planned Parenthood right now, what do they fear the most? How can pro-life people encourage them to stop doing what they're doing?
I think they fear the most losing the funding. I mean, think about this. I don't know what the number is. What is it? Something like $1 million a day from the federal government, from the feds, and then you add to that what happens at the state level. And I think it's been very smart to look at legislation to do the defunding from state to state. Certainly then you have the battle still for the Title X dollars that are the federal pass-through dollars. But if you can even choke off the funding line from one side of it, you really start to chip away at it. For example, in Texas, I forget the number, but over a dozen Planned Parenthood clinics have had to close because of the way the budget was done and the way they did funding there. So funding was choked off. So I think that's going to be one of the really important places to go. I also, you know, think that really educating people and really doing more around the fetal pain bills and parental notification and sonograms are, you know, we have to do all of these things. And, you know, and I will just say, we're not always going to have 100% pure, if you will, candidates for elected office. I would not call myself 100% pure, if you will, because I do believe in the exceptions. But are we not doing the overall movement a great disservice by settling for the all and then sometimes getting nothing?
There's also been some investigative reporting about Planned Parenthood in terms of breaking the law, not reporting statutory rape.
Right.
Gracie Howard, whom just about all of you know here, one of the students, wrote an article in World. She's been an intern for World last semester, and she wrote an article about very gutsy 23-year-old who goes into Planned Parenthood clinics with a camera and so forth, and for our project. So is that type of stuff, do you think, useful to do? Is this, how can young people be involved in sometimes in things of that sort, but in other ways too? What would you recommend to folks here? We're going to go to, by the way, to questioning from you in just a moment, but what do you recommend for students here who are pro-life? What's the best way that they can be of service?
Get involved with campaigns and candidates, and look to elect individuals who not just check the box for being pro-life, because that is not enough. That is not enough to just get endorsements from the state Right to Life and check all the boxes. What has to happen is for the individual to be willing to put personal sacrifice on the table to advance pro-life culture, pro-life legislation. I also think, and it's no disrespect to all the great guys in the room, but sometimes, you can have a really great message, but if you have the wrong messenger, it's hard for it to resonate with folks. And we do need to have more women who are willing to talk about how evil abortion is and that it is killing babies, and for those of us who are the women to stand up and start to be a voice on this issue. I mean, I think just look at the congressional hearing that was held on the contraception issue. The whole entire message was lost. Why? Not because of the message, but because of the messengers. And so the most impactful thing that I think all of you can do is be involved in campaigns for really good candidates who are going to do more than check the box, who are really going to stand up and be supporters of pro-life legislation and a pro-life culture.
Okay, questions for anyone, either about this particular recent news or...
Don't be shy.
Yeah.
And will you tell me your name when you do it, just so I can...
My name is Karis.
Hi, Karis.
You spoke well of Komen and you resigned. Would you support Komen today, and if so, how and to what extent?
The question is whether or not I still support Komen and I resign. I resigned for a couple of reasons. First of all, it was most certainly in the organization's best interest. I had become kind of the focal point on all of this, and it is a good organization that does good things. And I'll come back to that purity comment earlier. Sometimes things aren't 100%. And, I'll let everyone in this room make their own decision around whether or not they feel they can support Komen. But what I would ask is that you try to look at sort of all the things that the organization does and then come to your own conclusion. I think you all are smart enough to be able to do that. What else? Yeah.
Mrs. Handel, my name is Katie Tipton. You spoke of the way that Planned Parenthood was able to kind of summon their forces in response to what was happening with your situation. What does the pro-life world need to have in place to respond to similar situations?
We better get our acts together on social media. I was having a conversation earlier today, and they were telling me that on Facebook, Obama has something like 22 million, I think it is, friends and likes on his Facebook page. And the closest that any Republican comes to that is 1.5 million. Think about that. And email is not the way anymore. I wish it was. I mean, our emails at Komen were running, I think we had something like 80,000 emails that I saw before I resigned. And they were running either 2-to-1 or 3-to-1 in support of the decision. But it wasn't breaking through for anyone because email wasn't what anybody was looking at. It's at social media, and we need to be able to be players in that space to be able to rally our folks when it's time to stand up and make the call and have people actually answer the call. And that also brings me back to messenger. Who is the individual who can really go out and rally people, make the call, and then get people to rise up to the call?
The day you resigned, I saw you being interviewed on Fox News. Mm-hmm. Does that help? Did that help? And Fox wasn't around 20 years ago. Is that a...
I think it does help, but, you know, much like, I mean, I think the Fox News shows and even talk radio, those are the things that, you know, really help conservatives break through in the 90s, right? But what is the platform today? It's social media. I mean, social media kind of is the new talk radio, and if you will, it seems to me.
So it's striking on life issues that that's not really happening because, at least from the surveys I've seen, people the age of most of the folks in the audience here, at least the students, tend to be more pro-life than their elders. I mean, that's, right. But you're saying it's really not happening in terms of that.
Oh, and you know, I had another thought. The other place that, I don't know how many of you are interested in journalism, but wow, do we need some conservative journalists, not just on Fox News, but in the mainstream press. I mean, when most of the stories around Planned Parenthood are carried on Life News and that's it, that is not enough. That's not enough.
Yeah. Other questions?
Don't be shy, y'all. Does anybody in the room want to ever be an elected official, run for office?
One guy over there. So, what, go ahead.
Do you have a question over here?
Have you thought about what's next for you?
I haven't really. You know, I was saying earlier to Marvin that I really did go to Komen to sort of have a little bit of respite from some of the controversial issues, and then as the Planned Parenthood issues started to intensify, I love to play golf, and so I was talking to one of my girlfriends, and I said, oh, I just don't know how. I mean, Planned Parenthood again. When am I ever going to just be rid of this? And she just said, look, I don't know what it is about you, but it's somehow you always end up around that issue. I think you frankly need to go do some praying. God clearly wants you to be involved in this, and you need to just embrace it. So I don't know if I can be a voice around what that organization is and what it did to a good organization like Komen, and the absolute just disgust that I have that our tax dollars go to that organization, then I'd like to help be a voice on that. Other than that, I don't know yet.
Since your resignation, have you felt the support of the Right to Life community? Have they rallied around you in any tangible way?
I've had a number of folks reach out. I will say that's not the case about the Georgia Right to Life individual. But by and large, yes, which has been very gratifying, you know, for just the emails that I receive from people, phone calls, you know, notes in the mail, comments on Facebook, have just been extraordinary. And for the most part, you know, for all the really horrible things that were put out on Twitter and LinkedIn and some of the Facebook posts, they were far outweighed by the graciousness and generosity and kindness.
When you were in the middle of this firestorm, you were at least able to go on, do some interviews and so forth. How about your husband? How did he react to all this?
You know, Steve his nickname on the campaign trail was Prince, because he is a prince among men, and I will be forever, ever grateful that God graced me with his presence in my life. And he was nothing but supportive, you know, obviously, you know, angry, because when all is said and done, I'm not Karen Handel who ran for governor, or Karen Handel who works for Komen. I'm just Karen, the girl he married, and so that protective nature came out from him. But he, just as he always has, he's been beside me, and he is the place that I can always go if I feel sad, the place I can always go to feel safe, and the one person who can make me laugh in the middle of the toughest, hardest thing ever. So for all the gals, I hope that your lives are graced with someone as wonderful as Steve, too. And guys, take note.
Say George.
Karen,
Yes,
George
George.
Clay. Can you detail a little bit more about the decision that was made by Komen to not fund the Planned Parenthood affiliates and then further the decision to reverse that?
The decision to not fund Planned Parenthood was really taken as a result of a couple of things. One, the change in the granting strategy. What Komen had begun back, I think, in 2010 was to take a look at its grants, figure out, okay, with 90 million plus, we really have to make the most impact possible with these grants. So education grants were one thing that were looked at very, very closely. Did it make sense to fund, let's say, a Hispanic language education program in every community across the country? Or was it more cost effective and impactful to create a national program that then could be rolled out across the community, so then you weren't duplicating the dollars? So that was one effort. And clearly, most of Planned Parenthood's grants were education in nature. The second component was, did it make more sense to, where possible, give the dollars to the actual service provider and eliminate the middleman, if you will? Planned Parenthood for mammograms is a middleman. It's a pass-through for the referrals. So there was that component. Then you looked at the intensifying backlash that Komen was facing for actually doing the grants in the first place, from withdrawal from the Races for the Cure to an uptick in our corporate donors getting pushback from their pro-life customers. So just as we saw the pushback from the left, there was pushback over here as well. Then you coupled that with the growing number of investigations, in particular into Medicare, Medicaid fraud in a couple of states. Texas has one currently now. Also into not following the anti-abortion laws on the books now in terms of age and notification, to the criminal investigations in Kansas, and then on top of that, the congressional investigation. And albeit that may or may not be political in nature, wasn't our issue. It was the fact that it was happening. And so all of those things together really got the organization to a place of saying, how much time and energy are we going to spend as a breast cancer organization trying to mitigate the issues of another entity which are not ours? So it was all of those things. And then we just decided to move forward. The proposal was presented to the Komen Board of Directors. It was made clear that it was going to be effective January 1, and that was done in November. Those who may have been opposed didn't say anything in the meeting, and so off we went to do the implementation. In terms of the reversal, that happened the Friday morning. I will say, for me personally, very disappointing. From a personal perspective, not from an ideological perspective, but a personal perspective, that the organization didn't have the fortitude to hold the line was very disturbing. But as I said, I try to be respectful that that was the decision, and the board and the president, Ambassador Brinker, and Liz Thompson both felt strongly that the organization needed to reverse course, or companies were going to just be withdrawing their funds, and then where would the organization be?
Hi, Cece Komen.
Hi, Cece.
Sort of in response to that, because I was really disappointed with the fact that they backed down and felt the same way. Are they giving up 100% on ever pulling those grants from Planned Parenthood, or are they just saying we can never beat them, so we're just going to go along with this forever? Do you know if they have a long-term strategy for removing themselves eventually? Or?
I don't know. I really don't know. I just know what the statement was that was announced that Friday, which was to just revise the criteria a little bit, and Planned Parenthood then became eligible. And in the end, the Komen affiliates, when they look at doling out their grants, they will make the decision. I think it's fair to assume that there will be a significant increase in the number of Planned Parenthood applications for grants just to test the system. And then ultimately, when all organizations, nonprofits have to file what's called 990 tax returns, and all of that information will eventually become available, and you'll be able to monitor it through that and through the Komen websites.
But the initial optimistic speculation by some pro-life bloggers was this is a clever Komen strategy to try to tamp down on all the furor, but it's not really necessarily a reversal. But you're saying that you believe it to really be a reversal.
I believe, my understanding is it's a reversal.
Okay.
I'm Bonnie Libby.
Hi.
I appreciated your comment that women's rights do not equal abortion rights, which are so linked in public thinking right now. And I was wondering, how do you begin to separate those in the public sphere? What are the arguments you use?
Well, does anybody really have the right to just decide and choose to kill a baby? Isn't that argument enough? And it means that, women in particular, I mean, I don't know about y'all, but I'm mad. I'm mad that somehow women and women's rights being able to have equal chance at college, to be on a level playing field in the corporate world, to be able to succeed, to be able to determine whether or not we want to get married and whether or not we want to have careers. Aren't y'all mad that all of that is being equated to having the right to kill a baby? And maybe, just maybe, it means that instead of letting the left somehow be the voice of women, that we need to stand up and speak out.
Hello, Forrest Gaffney.
Forrest.
I had a question. You talked about the need to have the right messenger, say, for this issue. The question I would have is, what role would you see as the male in this whole process? Is it more of a passive support, or like what would male advocacy on this issue look like?
I mean, I think there's that men continuing to speak out the way that they are is really important and must continue. I mean, God also have a dose of candidness that in most of the state legislatures and in Congress, it's mostly the guys. So it's important that y'all continue to be front and center on the issue. What I'm saying is that, we have to be sensitive that if we're going to win the argument against the other side, because we're not talking to ourselves, folks. Most of us in this room are already in agreement, right? We're not trying to convince each other. We're trying to convince everyone else. And when we give the other side that room to recoil because there wasn't a single woman at that congressional hearing speaking, then we make the issue about that instead of what the underlying debate is. So that's really all I was getting at. And plus I do think, and I will say, women are held to a higher standard on the issue than men. And my husband right now and anybody involved in my campaign is going, oh my gosh, here she goes. But it is true. I mean, it's a different thing for women. And, when I don't know a single man on the campaign trail, at least in the governor's race, who was asked to prove that he was pro-life. It was enough that they just checked the boxes. Why is that enough? And not enough for a female candidate? Why?
Hello, my name's Marcia Schreiber.
Hi, Marcia.
Hi. I'm very curious about something. The decision that the Komen Foundation made to choose Planned Parenthood because of an educational focus speaks to me of, in the context of breast cancer, how is that equated? Planned Parenthood is not about breast cancer. Komen G Foundation should be concerned about organizations that they choose to really provide education to the women about how to identify breast cancer, what to do in case they do find a lump, and support this woman. This is not the focus of Planned Parenthood. And since they're giving grants to Planned Parenthood, is there an evaluation tool about what kind of education are they really doing for this? I've never heard of one woman going to Planned Parenthood and getting a breast exam. Can you speak to that?
Well, I'll try. I mean, you were making virtually the same argument that I would make. I mean, look, first of all, it used to be 20 years ago in a lot of communities for low-resource women, there weren't a lot of options. And so maybe I'll give folks the benefit of the doubt that maybe that was, you know, an only resource in a community. But that is most certainly not the case today. And, you know, to reach vulnerable women, I'm sorry, Planned Parenthood is not the sole outlet. And Komen, in looking at this analysis of its grants, that's really what you articulated was exactly where the organization was going, that there were other options. There did exist a better way, a more impactful way to reach women. And simply saying that you were holding an education symposium, so what? Is that really an outcome? So what if women sat in a room and they heard a presentation about getting their mammogram? The real impact, the real measure of the grant was tracking whether or not the women who were in the education program actually got the mammogram. And so that is indeed where the organization was going in this change of strategy in its granting model. And I can only hope that they will continue to push in that direction.
So you've very eloquently defended the right to life for each child. I mean, let me throw at you the question, certainly, that the Georgia right to life does and has. Mm-hmm. Don't you weaken that argument if you have a rape or incest exception?
You know, I'm not sure I'm the judge and jury on that. There is the compassion side of things that, I mean, I think about, I mean, I don't want to do a hypothetical on you, but I think about a mom and dad whose 13-year-old is raped and then has the double misfortune of becoming pregnant. And my only point is that I don't know how it becomes my place to tell that family what to do. What I do believe is my place is to do what I can do to build a pro-life culture, because in doing that, then you will create, I believe, in the majority of instances, a place where that family is going to be at the place of choosing life. But I just remain uncomfortable of coming into for a minor child to say what will or will not happen there. And your next question will be on the fertility side. I mean, yes, have some rules and regulations around it. Absolutely. Because, you know, you shouldn't be able to do the Octomom and destroy embryos, etc. But again, I am not prepared to look. I mean, people I know personally who have wonderful children, do we tell them that they're immoral? Yeah. I don't, and I guess it's a question of I don't know. It's something that I pray about and think about and talk to my pastor about a lot. But sometimes you can't, sometimes not every single aspect of a moral society can be legislated. You have to create the moral society based on who we are and our beliefs and our compass.
Yeah, 20 years ago, or let's say throughout the 1980s, a lot of pro-life organizations spent more time fighting each other than sometimes fighting the abortionists.
Yeah.
But around 1989, 1990, 91, there were a series of meetings that brought, I think for a time, a certain unity to the pro-life movement, or at least and the 11th commandment of sort of Republicans that used to be upheld also, namely do not be attacking other Republicans. That seems to be falling apart now the last several years. And this is just something to watch. And Susan wrote about this recently. There's almost a three-way division now that's starting to occur. There are the incrementalists, and there has been a lot of success.
Tremendous success.
Tremendous success in at least reducing the number of abortions from 1.6 million to 1.1 or 1.2. Still a heinous number, but nevertheless, lots of lives saved.
But more importantly, or equally as important, creating a culture where, as you pointed out earlier, this generation of young people are much more pro-life than the generation before them. That, to me, is probably the biggest success in really having a long-term pro-life culture in this country and around the world.
Yeah. And then there's the heartbeat movement, which I think has a lot of resilience. Certainly evokes that, namely, once the heartbeat of the unborn child is there, then no abortions, period. And then there's the personhood movement, which I guess Georgia Right to Life is particularly committed to, and so forth. I mean, I'm concerned. I have my own beliefs about this, but I'm concerned that these groups are going to start tearing each other apart, and that won't be helpful to anyone except the abortionists.
Divide and conquer.
Yeah. Questions about this? Comments? We have maybe a couple minutes left. Go ahead.
My name's Colleen McGowan, and I'm a breast cancer survivor, and have supported Komen in the past, and have really.
How many years? Survivor.
4 years.
All right.
Thank you. So I'm really on the fence because I think they really do a lot of really good work, and there's a lot of women out there that posted a lot of things on the boards that I finally just said, you know, you have to get your information right. You just don't know what your information is. Yeah. So my question is, who made the first bad decision to give them the money to begin with, and were they bullied to do it?
Oh, gosh, I have no idea.
Because that would be a really good something to know.
I have no idea. It's the data that I could see at least back to the mid-90s, but before that, I don't know. You should ask them.
Kenny, any other questions? It's 7 o'clock, so just about time to stop.
Well, if I can just say thank you to, first of all, Marvin, thank you for inviting me. Thank you, and all of you. And what a really special community and place you've created here with Patrick Henry College. And it's really been an honor to be here, and I appreciate your welcoming me and your graciousness. So thank you.